Hollywood once sold Mamie Van Doren as a body. A flash of platinum hair, a painted mouth, a dangerous smile placed under studio lights and printed on posters as if the woman behind it were not supposed to age, speak, remember, or contradict the fantasy. Then, at 95 years old, she came back with a title that sounded almost like a challenge. You thought I was dead. It was not the kind of title a forgotten star chooses by accident. It was the kind of title that opens a locked door. For decades, Mamie Van Doren had been remembered as one of Hollywood's original blonde bombshells, a name often placed beside Marilyn Monroe and Jayne Mansfield, as if the three women belonged less to history than to a glass case of desire. They were photographed, compared, marketed, and mythologized. They were turned into a kind of American shorthand for glamour. But glamour is never the whole story. By the time Mamie returned to the spotlight with a new memoir in 2026, the old Hollywood that had made her famous was mostly gone. The studio gates still existed, the movies still played, the photographs still glowed. But many of the people who knew what really happened behind those gates were dead, silent, or reduced to footnotes. Mamie was still here, and that changed everything. Because the question was no longer whether she had been beautiful. Hollywood had answered that question loudly, almost crudely, for most of her life. The question was what had been hidden behind that beauty. What did it cost a young woman to become a fantasy in a system run almost entirely by men? What happened when the image being sold no longer matched the life being lived? And what does a woman become when the world spends decades looking at her, but almost never listening to her? Mamie Van Doren's story is not simply the story of another blonde starlet from the 1950s. That version is too easy. It reduces her to hair color, curves, publicity, stills, and a few lines about being an answer to Marilyn. It keeps her inside the frame Hollywood built for her. The more unsettling story begins when that frame starts to crack. Behind the easy smile was a machinery that knew exactly how to manufacture desire. Studios did not only cast actors. They shaped them. They renamed them, dressed them, dated them, photographed them, and punished them when real life became inconvenient. A young actress could be encouraged to embody sex on screen, then judged harshly when her own body, her own choices, or her own private life refused to remain part of the fantasy. That contradiction sits at the center of Mamie's life. She was sold as a symbol of freedom, pleasure, and youth, yet the world around her often treated her image as something it owned. Her name could be promoted, her body could be marketed, her dates could be arranged, her reputation could be managed. But her truth had to wait. And it waited a very long time. The Mamie Van Doren who returned in her 90s was not trying to become young again. She was doing something more dangerous. She was returning as a witness, not just to famous men, famous parties, or famous scandals, but to a system that knew how to turn women into legends before it allowed them to be people. That is why her story still matters. Not because Hollywood forgot her, but because Hollywood remembered her in the easiest possible way. To understand what Mamie Van Doren was really carrying, we have to go back before the platinum hair became a brand. Before the studio lights found her. Before the world learned to see her as Mamie. Before Hollywood could turn her into an image, she was a girl with another name, standing at the edge of a dream that looked beautiful from the outside. And like many dreams in old Hollywood, the first door opened softly. Only later would she learn what it could take away. Before Hollywood gave her the name Mamie Van Doren, she was Joan Lucille Olander. That name matters, because it belonged to a girl who had not yet been turned into a poster. It belonged to someone before the platinum hair, before the publicity machine, before the comparisons to Marilyn Monroe and Jayne Mansfield began to follow her like a second shadow. She came from South Dakota, far from the world that would later claim to discover her. The prairie was not Hollywood. It did not offer studio gates, nightclub lights, or camera flashes. It offered space, distance, and a kind of plainness that made the dream of California feel even larger. For a girl like Joan, Hollywood was not just a place on a map. It was an escape route. It was a promise that life could be remade. And that promise was one of the most powerful things Hollywood ever sold. It sold it to audiences sitting in dark theaters, watching impossible faces fill the screen. It sold it to young women who believed that beauty could open a door. It sold it to girls from small towns who imagined that if they could just reach Los Angeles, everything ordinary about their lives could be left behind. But the promise came with a hidden condition. Hollywood did not only ask who you were. It asked what it could turn you into. Joan's path toward fame began with the kind of early attention that could feel innocent at first. Beauty contests, local recognition, the excitement of being seen, the first small signs that a face could become a future. She was young, striking, and ambitious enough to move toward the light rather than away from it. In another life, being noticed might have meant being understood. In Hollywood, it often meant being redesigned. The industry of the 1950s was not built around letting a young actress arrive as herself. It was built around transformation. A studio could take a girl's name and replace it with something smoother, more memorable, more marketable. It could adjust her hair, her clothes, her speech, her dates, her interviews, even the kinds of emotions the public was allowed to imagine she had. Joan Lucille Olander became Mamie Van Doren. The new name sounded brighter, sharper, easier to put on a marquee. It carried the faint glamour of invention, which was exactly the point. Hollywood was not simply introducing a young woman to the public. It was creating a product the public could desire. At first, that creation could look like a gift. There were photographs, tests, rooms where powerful men decided whether a woman's face had commercial value. There were opportunities that must have seemed impossible from the distance of South Dakota. There was the feeling of being chosen, of being pulled out of the crowd and placed closer to the dream everyone else was still chasing. That is the part of old Hollywood that remains seductive even now. It could make a person feel as if destiny had found them. But destiny, in a studio system, often came with paperwork. It came with expectations. It came with a version of yourself that other people began to protect more fiercely than your actual life. Mamie entered Hollywood at a time when the blonde bombshell was becoming one of the industry's most profitable fantasies. Marilyn Monroe had already changed the temperature of the screen. Jayne Mansfield would soon become another symbol of exaggerated glamour. The culture wanted women who looked like freedom, danger, innocence, and temptation all at once. That was not an easy space for a real person to live inside. A young actress could be encouraged to smile as if nothing touched her. She could be photographed as if she existed only for desire. She could be praised for being bold while being expected to obey. The more the public image glittered, the less room there was for private contradiction. This was the first crack in Mamie's story. It did not appear as a single disaster. It appeared as a slow exchange. A girl traded her original name for a name Hollywood could sell. She traded anonymity for visibility. She traded ordinary privacy for a manufactured image. And at first, the trade may have looked worth it, because the lights were real, the attention was real, the chance was real. But so was the cost. Hollywood was teaching Mamie something before the public ever knew her well. It was teaching her that being seen could be powerful, but it could also be dangerous. Once the camera decided what you represented, people stopped asking what you wanted. They asked whether you could keep representing it. That was the door she stepped through. Not a door marked tragedy. Not at first. It was marked opportunity. It was marked glamour. It was marked everything a young woman had been told to want. And for Mamie Van Doren, the door did open. It opened into studio offices, publicity photographs, screen tests, contracts, and the dazzling machinery of a Hollywood that knew exactly how to turn a woman into an image. But once that image began to sell, the question became more complicated. Who owned Mamie Van Doren? The woman herself? Or the Hollywood that had invented her? Hollywood did not simply introduce Mamie Van Doren. It packaged her. By the time her image began to move through magazines, movie posters, studio stills, and gossip columns, Mamie was no longer just a young woman trying to become an actress. She had become part of a larger Hollywood formula. The blonde bombshell was not only a type of beauty, it was a business model. The public was invited to see her as playful, daring, and dangerous in a way that still felt safe enough to sell. She could suggest rebellion without threatening the men who controlled the studio offices. She could look modern, sexual, and free, while the machinery around her remained old, strict, and deeply controlled. That was the contradiction. Mamie's image promised freedom, but the system that built it did not run on freedom. Universal saw in her something it could market. Platinum hair, a bold face, a figure that photographed with immediate force, a screen presence that could be placed into the youth culture of the 1950s, into rock and roll energy, into films that understood exactly what they were selling before the audience even bought a ticket. She was not treated as a quiet dramatic actress waiting for the right prestige role. That was not the box Hollywood chose for her. The industry looked at Mamie and saw heat. It saw publicity. It saw a woman who could stand in front of a camera and make the audience look twice. Once that happened, the roles followed the image. Films like Untamed Youth helped connect her to a new kind of screen energy, one tied to teenage rebellion, music, danger, and sexuality. Mamie did not need to be the most decorated actress in Hollywood to become recognizable. Her power was more immediate than awards. It was visual. It was cultural. It could be printed on a poster and understood in seconds. That kind of fame can be intoxicating. It can also be a trap. Because once the public learns to recognize a woman in one way, it often resists seeing her any other way. The blonde bombshell was supposed to be desirable, not complicated. She could be funny, flirtatious, rebellious, even scandalous in carefully controlled amounts. But she was not supposed to become too human. She was not supposed to remind the audience that a real person existed behind the image. Mamie's rise happened in the long shadow of Marilyn Monroe. That shadow mattered. Marilyn had become more than a star. She had become an idea. And once Hollywood discovers that an idea sells, it tries to repeat it. Jayne Mansfield became another version of that heightened blonde myth. Mamie Van Doren was placed into the same conversation, often remembered as part of the so-called 3Ms. Three women whose names became linked not because their lives were the same, but because Hollywood and the public wanted them to occupy the same fantasy. Marilyn, Mamie, Mansfield. Three names, three images. Three women turned into symbols before they were allowed to be fully understood as people. For Mamie, the comparison was useful and limiting at the same time. It gave her a place in the public imagination. It made her instantly legible, but it also reduced her. Instead of asking who she was, the culture kept asking which blonde she resembled, which fantasy she fulfilled, which version of desire she represented. That is how old Hollywood could flatten a woman while pretending to elevate her. It could put her face in front of millions and still make her feel replaceable. And the control did not stop at the screen. The studio system understood that publicity was part of performance. A star's life outside the camera could be arranged, hinted at, photographed, and fed into the same machine that sold the movies. Dates could become strategy, rumors could become currency. A woman's private evening could be turned into a public asset if it helped the studio shape her image. Mamie later described how studios could arrange dates between young actresses and famous male stars, not necessarily because love was involved, but because the pairing created the right kind of attention. In that world, romance could be publicity. Desire could be publicity. Even mystery could be publicity. One of the most revealing names in that part of her story was Rock Hudson. Mamie later recalled being placed in situations that helped support the image Hollywood wanted around him, the image of a handsome leading man pursued by women and desired by them. The point is not to turn that anecdote into gossip. The point is what it reveals about the machinery. Mamie was not the only person being packaged. Rock Hudson was being packaged too. His masculinity, her sexuality, their public appearance together, all of it could be shaped into a story the studio preferred. That was Hollywood's genius. It did not only sell movies, it sold versions of people. And those versions could be more valuable than the people themselves. For a while, Mamie's version sold beautifully. She became a face of a certain kind of 1950s glamour, bright and suggestive, a little rebellious, a little dangerous, but still framed for consumption. The camera knew what to do with her. The magazines knew what to do with her. The audience knew what it had been taught to expect. But the more successful the image became, the narrower the room around her grew. A woman marketed as a sex symbol could be celebrated for suggesting desire, but punished when her real life became too visibly her own. She could be used to sell a fantasy of adult freedom, while being expected to remain obedient to the rules of men who controlled contracts, publicity, and opportunity. That was the first real fracture in Mamie Van Doren's Hollywood story. Not a single broken heart, not one bad review, not one failed film. The fracture was built into the bargain itself. Hollywood wanted Mamie to embody a kind of freedom on screen, but off-screen, it wanted control. It wanted her image polished, her sexuality profitable, her private life manageable, and her choices quiet. For a time, those two realities could exist side by side. The public saw the blonde bombshell. The studio saw the asset. Mamie had to live as the woman between them. And soon, the life behind the image would become too real for Hollywood to keep inside the fantasy. The problem with a fantasy is that it can only survive as long as real life does not interrupt it. For Mamie Van Doren, real life did interrupt. Hollywood had been willing to sell her as a symbol of desire. It had placed her in front of cameras as a woman who suggested danger, sexuality, and adult freedom. It had used her look, her youth, and her image to create excitement around her name. But when that same woman stepped outside the fantasy and became visibly human, the rules changed. Mamie became pregnant. In another world, that might have been treated as a private turning point, a human event, a life decision between adults. But old Hollywood was not another world. It was an industry obsessed with appearances, and the burden of those appearances often fell hardest on women. A male star could be protected by silence. His scandals could be softened, hidden, excused, or reshaped into charm. A woman, especially a woman whose image had been built around sex, could be judged by a far harsher standard. That was the cruelty at the center of Mamie's image. Hollywood could ask her to look desirable, but it did not want the consequences of desire to become visible. She would later describe a studio world run by men, a world where women were valuable when they could be shaped, photographed, and sold, but far less protected when their actual lives became inconvenient. After she became pregnant outside of marriage and gave birth to her son in 1956, Universal dropped her. That detail cuts through the glamour more sharply than any rumor could, because it reveals the bargain Mamie had been living inside. The studio could market her body, but it did not want her body to belong to her. It could profit from her sexuality, but it did not want her sexuality to become part of a real, complicated life. It could sell the idea of freedom, but only if that freedom remained on a poster. The public image was supposed to stay smooth. Motherhood made it complicated, and old Hollywood did not like complicated women unless it could turn their pain into a role. This was not simply a career setback. It was a collision between the fantasy Mamie had been hired to represent and the woman she actually was. A young mother, an actress, a person with responsibilities that could not be managed by a publicity department. In that moment, the blonde bombshell image began to show its limits. The world had been invited to desire Mamie, but not necessarily to respect her. It had been invited to look at her, but not necessarily to imagine her carrying a child, making choices, facing consequences, or needing protection. Hollywood wanted the glow, not the weight. It wanted the image, not the woman underneath it. And that was only one part of the private storm. In her later accounts, Mamie also described the darker machinery surrounding young actresses in that era. The casting couch was not a myth invented years later to make old Hollywood sound dangerous. It was part of a culture many women have since described in different ways, a system where access, roles, promises, and male power could blur into pressure. For Mamie, these memories did not belong to gossip. They belonged to survival. The point is not to turn every closed office door into a scene we cannot prove. The point is that Mamie's story sits inside a larger pattern. Young actresses arrived in Hollywood hoping to be discovered, and discovery often meant being evaluated by men who controlled contracts, cameras, publicity, and opportunity. Beauty could open the door. It could also make a woman more vulnerable once she walked through it. That is why her memoir matters beyond the names and anecdotes. It is not only a collection of stories from parties, sets, and famous men. It is the testimony of someone who lived inside the machinery while it was still running. Someone who understood that old Hollywood did not need to shout to control a woman. It could smile. It could flatter. It could offer a screen test. It could arrange a date. It could call something opportunity when it was really a test of obedience. And if a woman refused the role assigned to her, the room could grow cold very quickly. Mamie's public persona made her look untouchable. That was part of the trick. The blonde bombshell was supposed to appear confident, amused, and in control. She was supposed to look as if she knew exactly what effect she had on men. But image is not power when someone else owns it. The more Mamie was sold as a sexual figure, the easier it became for the industry to reduce her to that figure. If she complained, she risked being difficult. If she played along, the image grew stronger. If she wanted more, she had to push against the very fantasy that had made her famous. That is a lonely kind of trap. Not the loneliness of being unknown, but the loneliness of being known incorrectly. Mamie Van Doren was not the only woman caught in that contradiction. She was part of a generation of actresses whose glamour was treated as public property. Their faces were remembered, their bodies were discussed, their reputations were managed. But their full humanity often had to wait decades to be taken seriously. Some did not live long enough to reclaim it. Mamie did. That is what makes her return so quietly powerful. She did not come back as a young woman asking Hollywood to approve of her. She came back after the system had lost much of its old authority, after many of its gatekeepers were gone, after the public had begun to ask different questions about power, gender, and silence. The woman once punished for being too real had outlived the machinery that tried to contain her, but survival did not erase the cost. It only gave her time to name it. After the studio glow began to fade, Mamie still had to live with the image Hollywood had built around her. She still had to move through an industry that could remember her face more easily than her voice. She still had to decide whether the name Mamie Van Doren would remain a fantasy from the 1950s or become something more complicated. And as the spotlight changed, another question began to emerge. When Hollywood no longer needs the fantasy it created, what happens to the woman left standing behind it? When the studio spotlight began to change, Mamie Van Doren did not disappear. But Hollywood has many ways of making a woman feel as if she has. There is the loud version of fame, the kind that arrives with posters, premieres, interviews, and photographers calling your name. Then there is the quieter version that comes after, when the industry has moved on to a new face, a new fantasy, a new girl who can be packaged for a different decade. For Mamie, life after the first heat of stardom was not a simple fall. It was more complicated than that. She kept working. She kept appearing. She remained a recognizable figure in American pop culture. But the center of Hollywood had changed around her, and the image that once made her valuable could also keep her trapped. The blonde bombshell was a powerful entrance. It was not always a generous exit. Once a woman had been sold as a symbol of youth and sex, the industry often struggled to imagine her aging, changing, thinking, or surviving outside that frame. The audience might remember the photograph, the poster, the pose, but the real person had to keep living after the image had already been frozen. That was one of the strange burdens Mamie carried. She had been made memorable by a version of herself that could not grow old. Yet she herself did grow older. She saw Hollywood move from studio contracts to new kinds of filmmaking, from old publicity machines to new media, from carefully managed gossip columns to a culture that eventually began asking harder questions about power. And through all of it, Mamie was still there. That survival is easy to underestimate. Many Hollywood legends become larger because they vanish early. Marilyn Monroe became immortal partly because the world never had to watch her age. Jayne Mansfield's image was sealed by tragedy. Their beauty remained suspended in time, untouched by the later years that make a person more complex. Mamie's story took a different path. She lived long enough to become inconvenient to the myth. Because a myth wants a woman to stay young, silent, and perfectly lit. A living woman does not obey those rules. She remembers. She revises. She contradicts. She grows sharper with time. She looks back at the image everyone else accepted and asks who paid for it. That is what makes Mamie's later life so important to the story. It is not just the chapter after fame. It is the chapter where fame itself begins to look different. She moved through a long afterlife of interviews, appearances, memoirs, reflections, and cultural rediscovery. For some viewers, she became a cult figure, a reminder of a wilder edge of 1950s and 1960s Hollywood. For others, she remained a name attached to the old phrase, blonde bombshell, as if that phrase could explain an entire life. But a phrase cannot hold 95 years. It cannot hold the young woman who crossed into Hollywood with ambition. It cannot hold the actress who learned how quickly attention could turn into control. It cannot hold the mother who discovered that the same industry selling her as a sexual fantasy could judge her harshly when her real body and real life disrupted the image. It cannot hold the older woman who would one day look back and decide that the story was not finished. That is why the memoir matters. You Thought I Was Dead was not simply a late career project. It was a reclamation of presence. The title carried a sting because it named what often happens to women like Mamie in public memory. They are not always forgotten completely. Instead, they are remembered in a way that leaves them no room to speak. The world keeps the image and loses the voice. Mamie's return pushed against that. She was not asking to be reintroduced as if she had never existed. She was reminding the public that existing in someone else's memory is not the same as being heard. She had been seen for decades. Now she was telling the audience that seeing had never been enough. By then, Hollywood had changed so much that some of the old rules seemed almost unbelievable. Studio-arranged dates, manufactured identities, contracts tied to moral expectations. A culture where men could protect one another while young actresses navigated power with very little protection of their own. But to call it unbelievable would be too easy. The photographs are still beautiful. The films still have charm. The glamour still works on us. That is the uncomfortable part. Old Hollywood did not look sinister from the outside. It looked elegant. It looked exciting. It looked like a dream people were lucky to enter. Mamie's later years asked the harder question. What if the dream was real, and the cost was real too? What if a woman could be grateful for the career, proud of the work, amused by the mythology, and still honest about the machinery that used her? What if survival did not mean bitterness, but clarity? That is the tone Mamie brought back with her, not the panic of someone trying to expose everything at once, but the steadier force of someone who had waited long enough to tell the story in her own time. The spotlight that once framed her body had faded, but fading is not always an ending. Sometimes it is the first moment when the person inside the image can finally be seen without all that light in the way. And for Mamie Van Doren, the years after the brightest glare did not erase the old wounds. They revealed what had been there all along. A woman still standing behind the fantasy, with memories Hollywood could no longer control. But some of those memories were not only about fame. Some were about the people who came close, the choices that changed everything, and the private life that proved Mamie was never just the image Hollywood had sold. Behind the blonde bombshell image, there was a life that could not be flattened into publicity. There were men, there were marriages, there were rumors, dates, near misses, and names that still carry old Hollywood electricity. But if Mamie Van Doren's private life is treated only as a list of famous encounters, then the deeper story is lost. The real question is not how many men passed through the story. The real question is who was allowed to see the woman behind the image. That question became sharper when Mamie became a mother. For a star whose public value had been tied so heavily to sex appeal, motherhood created a kind of rupture. It pulled her out of the fantasy and into reality. A poster could stay smooth and untouched, but a mother could not. A mother had responsibilities. A mother had a private life that could not be completely controlled by a studio. A mother had to make decisions that did not always serve the image. And in Mamie's case, motherhood arrived at a cost. After giving birth to her son in 1956, she was no longer just the blonde figure Hollywood could market without complication. She was a young woman whose life had become visible in a way the studio system did not welcome. The same industry that had profited from her desirability now had to confront the fact that she was not merely a symbol of desire. She was a person living with the consequences of real intimacy, real choices, and real responsibility. That made her harder to package. It also made her more human. There is something revealing in that contradiction. Hollywood could ask audiences to imagine Mamie as daring, sexy, and free, but it did not seem prepared to protect her when freedom became life outside the camera. The fantasy had been profitable as long as it remained controlled. Motherhood broke that control. It gave Mamie an identity that no publicity department had created. And perhaps that is why this part of her story matters so much. Her son was not a side detail. He was a reminder that the woman being sold on screen had a private world that continued after the director called cut. She was not only a face under lights. She was someone who had to go home, make choices, carry fear, earn money, and live with the results. That private world shaped the way she moved through danger. One of the most striking stories Mamie later recounted involved Steve Cochran, a famously magnetic and troubled actor whose life ended during a voyage by yacht. Mamie has described narrowly avoiding that trip, choosing not to go because she had responsibilities, including her life as a mother and work ahead of her. The point is not to turn that moment into a cheap thriller. The point is what it reveals. In old Hollywood, glamour often came wrapped around risk. The parties, the boats, the famous men, the invitations that sounded exciting from the outside could carry a different weight for a woman who understood how quickly charm could turn into danger. A single decision could become a dividing line. One evening accepted or refused. One trip taken or missed. One door opened or left closed. Mamie's survival was not only luck, it was also instinct. And motherhood gave that instinct a sharper edge. For the public, Mamie's private relationships could easily become entertainment. That was how the machinery worked. A date could become a headline. A flirtation could become a rumor. A woman's proximity to a famous man could become part of her market value. Even intimacy could be turned into publicity if the studio needed the story. But inside that world, the woman herself had to navigate the emotional consequences. To be desired by the public is not the same as being known. To be surrounded by attention is not the same as being protected. And to be placed near powerful men is not the same as having power. That was one of the hidden injuries of Mamie's kind of fame. The world could assume that a sex symbol was always in control of desire, simply because she appeared to inspire it. But appearance is not control. A woman can be looked at by millions and still be alone in the moments when choices become dangerous, humiliating, or difficult. Mamie's story forces that distinction into the open. She lived in a Hollywood where romance could be managed by publicity, where male stars could be protected by myth, and where young actresses learned to read a room quickly. They had to know when attention was opportunity and when it was something else. They had to know when a smile was harmless and when it came with expectations. They had to know when the fantasy being sold around them was beginning to close in. That kind of knowledge does not usually appear in glamorous photographs, but it is part of what the photographs conceal. In Mamie's case, the people around her often became mirrors of the system itself. Rock Hudson, for example, was not important to her story because of gossip alone. He mattered because his image, like hers, was shaped by Hollywood's need for illusion. The studio wanted him seen a certain way. It wanted Mamie seen a certain way. And when their public images touched, the machine could use both of them. That was the strange intimacy of old Hollywood. People could be placed close together not because the relationship was real, but because the story looked useful. For a woman like Mamie, that meant even private life could become part of the performance. Love, desire, reputation, motherhood, and publicity all blurred under the same lights. And the more the public believed in the fantasy, the less it asked what that fantasy demanded from the person inside it. Yet Mamie kept choosing life beyond the image. She raised a child, she worked, she moved through relationships without allowing them to become the entire definition of her. She survived invitations she did not take, roles she outgrew, and a culture that often wanted her story to remain decorative. That is why the family and love chapter of Mamie Van Doren's life should not be read as scandal. It should be read as evidence. Evidence that the blonde bombshell was never only a studio creation. She was a woman making decisions in a world that wanted to make decisions for her. A woman whose private life was not a footnote to fame, but the place where the cost of fame became most visible. And still, even those private memories were not the final layer. Because Mamie's life also carried the shadows of other women, women who entered the same dream and did not survive long enough to tell their own version. To understand what the world missed in Mamie Van Doren, we have to look not only at what Hollywood made of her, but at what she lived long enough to remember. By the time Mamie Van Doren reached her 90s, the world that had created her image had become a museum of itself. Old photographs had softened, studio scandals had become documentaries. The blonde bombshells of the 1950s had turned into cultural symbols, studied and recycled, admired and misunderstood. Marilyn Monroe became an eternal wound in American memory. Jayne Mansfield became a glamorous warning wrapped in tragedy. Mamie Van Doren remained something different. She was still alive to answer back. That is the part of her legacy that changes the story. For years, Mamie could be remembered in the easiest possible way. She was the platinum blonde, the sex symbol, the universal starlet, one of the women placed near Marilyn and Mansfield in the public imagination. Her image was vivid enough that people did not always ask for more. But vivid is not the same as complete. A poster can preserve a face and still erase a person. A publicity still can make a woman unforgettable and still leave her unheard. That is what happened to many women of old Hollywood. They were remembered visually before they were remembered truthfully. The audience knew the hair, the smile, the body, the pose, but the machinery behind the pose stayed out of focus. Mamie's later voice brought that machinery back into focus. Her memoir did not matter only because it promised famous names or old secrets. It mattered because it came from a woman who had been inside the system when the system still believed it could control the story forever. She had seen how young actresses were renamed, shaped, displayed, and judged. She had lived through the contradiction of being marketed as desire and punished for being human. She had watched glamour become a mask, and she had outlived enough of the mask to speak from behind it. That is where Mamie becomes more than a sex symbol. She becomes a witness. And witnesses are dangerous to myths. A myth wants simplicity. It wants a clean image, a perfect caption, a woman frozen at the age when the camera loved her most. But a witness brings time into the room. A witness remembers who was nervous, who was powerful, who was protected, who disappeared, and who learned to stay quiet. Mamie's memories reached beyond her own image. They touched the edges of a Hollywood where many young women arrived with hope and very little protection. Some became stars. Some became names in newspaper archives. Some became stories no one told correctly. Among the most haunting memories Mamie later shared was her connection to Elizabeth Short, the young woman the world would come to know through the brutal mythology of the Black Dahlia case. That story should not be treated as a cheap mystery in Mamie's life. Its power lies somewhere quieter and more painful. It reminds us that behind the glamour of Los Angeles were women trying to be seen, trying to survive, trying to move through a city that could turn beauty into opportunity or danger. Mamie lived. Elizabeth Short did not. That contrast does not need exaggeration. It is already heavy enough. It places Mamie's survival in a different light. She was not simply a woman who managed to keep working after the peak of her fame. She was someone who moved through a world where youth, beauty, and ambition could attract both attention and risk. She lived long enough to remember women who did not get to correct the record. She lived long enough to see the culture begin to question the same machinery that had once seemed untouchable. And so her legacy cannot be measured only by film titles or box office numbers. It has to be measured by what her story reveals. Mamie Van Doren's legacy is the uncomfortable truth that old Hollywood glamour was not false, but it was incomplete. The beauty was real. The excitement was real. The movies, the posters, the desire, the thrill of being chosen, all of it was real. But so were the contracts, so were the double standards, so were the arranged images, the moral judgments, the private pressures, and the silence women were expected to carry if they wanted to keep working. For decades, the public saw Mamie as part of a fantasy. Now, the fantasy has to make room for the woman who survived it. That is the reframe. She was not merely one of the blonde bombshells who followed Marilyn's shadow. She was not merely an artifact of 1950s sexuality. She was not merely a provocative actress whose image belonged to a certain era of American movies. She was a woman who watched Hollywood invent her, profit from her, limit her, and then underestimate how long she would last. The studio system could shape the name Mamie Van Doren. It could sell the image. It could place her beside famous men, compare her to other blondes, and remember her in shorthand, but it could not decide the final meaning of her life. That part took time. It took aging. It took memory. It took the courage to speak after the culture had already decided what you were supposed to represent. And perhaps that is why the title "You Thought I Was Dead" feels less like a joke than a correction, because Mamie was never dead. She was only buried under an image, and by returning with her own story, she forced the audience to look again. Not at the bombshell Hollywood sold, but at the human being who had been standing behind the photograph all along. In the end, Mamie Van Doren's story is not only about a woman who became famous, it is about a woman who survived the image that made her famous. For most of her public life, the world knew what to do with her face. It knew how to frame the platinum hair, how to describe the body, how to place her beside Marilyn Monroe and Jayne Mansfield, how to turn her into shorthand for a certain kind of old Hollywood desire. The image was easy to understand. That was why it sold. But people are not images. They keep living after the poster is printed. They keep changing after the camera stops. They carry memories that cannot be touched by publicity, and wounds that do not always look dramatic enough for headlines. Mamie lived long enough for the glamour around her to become history. She lived long enough for the old studio system to lose its power. She lived long enough for the culture to begin asking questions that women of her generation were often discouraged from asking out loud. Who controlled the story? Who profited from the fantasy? Who paid the emotional price when the fantasy broke? Those questions are what remain when the surface begins to fade. Mamie was not the first woman Hollywood turned into a symbol, And she was not the last. But her story carries a rare kind of weight because she stayed. Not always at the center of the spotlight, not always in the way the industry wanted, but in the deeper sense, she stayed alive. She stayed aware. She kept the memories. And when she returned with her own words, she did not simply ask to be remembered. She asked to be reconsidered. That is the quiet power of "You thought I was dead." It sounds playful at first, almost sharp with old Hollywood wit. But underneath it is something more serious. It is the voice of a woman telling the world that forgetting does not make someone disappear. Reducing a person to an image does not erase the life behind it. Calling someone a bombshell does not explain what happened when the lights went down. For decades, Mamie Van Doren was looked at. Now, the more important thing is to listen, not because every memory turns Hollywood into darkness. The dream was real too. The excitement was real. The beauty was real. The thrill of being chosen, photographed, and placed before the public was real. But the cost was real as well, and Mamie's life asks us to hold both truths at the same time. That is often the most honest way to look at old Hollywood. Not as a paradise, not as a nightmare, but as a beautiful machine that could make legends while quietly asking human beings to become smaller than themselves. Mamie Van Doren refused to remain small. She outlived the comparisons. She outlived the easy labels. She outlived the men in studios that once helped define her. And in the end, the most interesting thing about her was never just that she had been desired, it was that she remembered. Somewhere between the old publicity stills and the older woman telling her story, the myth finally changes shape. The blonde bombshell is still there, frozen in light, forever young in the way Hollywood preferred. But now there is another image beside it. A woman in her 90s, no longer waiting for permission, opening the door to a past that once tried to own her. And this time, the story belongs to her. If you want to keep uncovering the human stories behind Hollywood's brightest legends, stay with Hollywood Legends.